A woman standing in front of a mirror, wearing a wedding dress that cost more than most people make in a year. Her hair is pinned up perfectly. Her makeup is flawless. The flowers in her hand are fresh white roses, his mother's choice, not hers. And as she stares at her own reflection, she feels absolutely nothing. No butterflies, no tears of joy, no racing hearts. Just silence. That woman was me. And the man waiting for me at the altar? I didn't love him, not even close. But I walked down that aisle anyway, with a smile so convincing, even I almost believed it. My name is Natalie. And this is the story of the worst decision I ever made, the unexpected thing that came from it, and the moment everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and myself fell completely apart. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand where I came from to understand why I did what I did. I grew up without money. Not the romantic kind of we were poor but rich in love story you see in movies. I mean real poverty. The kind where your mother cries quietly at the kitchen table because the electricity bill is 3 months overdue. The kind where you wear the same pair of shoes through 2 winters because there's no money for new ones. The kind that leaves a mark on you, deep, permanent, invisible to everyone else, but always there, pressing against your chest like a stone. My mother worked 2 jobs her entire life and still struggled. My father left when I was 7. No goodbye, no explanation. Just an empty closet and a note that said, "I'm sorry." I remember staring at that note for a long time, trying to understand what he was sorry for, leaving or staying as long as he did. I promised myself from the time I was a teenager that I would never live like that. I would never be that woman crying over bills. I would never be left with nothing. And then I met Richard Calloway. Richard was 41 when I met him. I was 27. He walked into the restaurant where I was waitressing, this tall, silver-templed man in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he looked at me like I was something worth noticing. He came back the next Friday, and the one after that. The third time, he left his business card with his tip. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Dinner? Not here. Somewhere better. Call me if you're interested." I told my best friend Maya about it that night, and she grabbed the card and said, "Natalie, this man is loaded. Do not throw this away." I didn't throw it away. Richard Calloway was the founder of a real estate development company worth somewhere north of $40 million. He had a house, a proper estate, actually, about 40 minutes outside the city. He drove a car that I couldn't have named because I'd never been close enough to that kind of wealth to recognize it. He was charming in that careful, deliberate way that older wealthy men sometimes are. He chose his words precisely. He never laughed too loudly. He always knew the right restaurant, the right wine, the right thing to say. Was there attraction? Honestly, a little. Not the kind that sets your blood on fire, but the comfortable kind, the safe kind, the kind that whispers, "This man will never let you struggle." After 8 months of dating, he proposed over dinner in a private room at a rooftop restaurant. The ring was a 3-carat oval diamond. I looked at it and thought about my mother's electricity bill. I thought about the shoes I wore through 2 winters. I thought about that note on the kitchen table. I said yes. We got married 6 months later. The wedding was everything I had never let myself dream about. 250 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, flowers that were imported from the Netherlands, apparently. I only know that because Richard's mother, Margaret, mentioned it to every single person she spoke to that day. Margaret Calloway. Now there's a character. She was the kind of woman who smiled at you while making you feel completely inadequate. She had this talent, a gift, really, for delivering compliments that were somehow also criticisms. She looked at me on our wedding day and said, "You look absolutely beautiful, darling." Richard always did have a weakness for a pretty face. I smiled and thanked her. Inside, I filed it away. The wedding was beautiful. The speeches were perfect. The food was extraordinary. And when I finally stood at that altar across from Richard, hands in his, saying words I had rehearsed the night before in front of my bathroom mirror, I thought, this is fine. This is enough. Security is a form of love too, isn't it? I told myself that for a long time. What I hadn't expected, what I hadn't prepared myself for at all, was Daniel, Richard's younger brother. Daniel Calloway was 34, 7 years younger than Richard, and everything his brother was not. Where Richard was measured, Daniel was spontaneous. Where Richard was polished, Daniel was real. He worked as a structural engineer and showed up to the wedding rehearsal dinner in dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. And Margaret looked at him like he'd arrived in a bathrobe. He shook my hand when we were introduced, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "I hope he deserves you." Just like that. No ceremony, no careful phrasing, just honest words, quietly delivered. I didn't know what to say, so I laughed it off. But later that night, alone in the bathroom of the hotel, I stood at the sink and thought about it longer than I should have. I hope he deserves you. I told myself it meant nothing. I was wrong. And I had absolutely no idea that within 1 year of that wedding, Daniel Calloway would become the most dangerous person in my life. Not because he was cruel, but because he was everything I had never let myself want. Marriage, I learned quickly, is not one thing. It is 100 small things happening every day that either build you up or quietly hollow you out. With Richard, it was mostly the second one. Don't get me wrong, on paper, my life was everything I had wanted. The estate was stunning. 12 rooms, a garden that a full-time groundskeeper maintained, a kitchen bigger than the entire apartment I grew up in. I had a car now, a white SUV Richard had picked out for me without asking what I liked. I had a credit card with a limit I never reached. I had clothes and jewelry and invitations to charity galas where women air-kissed each other and talked about renovations on their vacation homes. I had everything, and somehow, in the middle of all of it, I was lonelier than I had ever been in my life. Richard worked. That was his primary identity, his first language, his truest love. He left before 7 every morning, and most nights he came home after 9, loosening his tie in the doorway, pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey, and asking me the same question every single night. "Everything okay?" Not, "How are you?" Not, "I missed you today." Not, "Tell me something." Just, "Everything okay?" And I would say yes, because everything was okay. Nothing was wrong. Exactly. There was no shouting, no cruelty, no obvious wound I could point to. There was just this wide, quiet distance between us, like we were two people living parallel lives inside the same expensive house. I tried, at first. I made dinners. I planned a weekend trip to the coast for our 3-month anniversary. I bought a book on building emotional intimacy. I know, and left it on the nightstand where he might notice it. He never noticed it. The weekend trip, he canceled 2 days before because of a deal closing. The dinners, he ate while scrolling through emails on his phone. One evening, I sat across from him at the long dining table, candles lit, music on softly in the background, and I thought, he doesn't even see me. Not really. I was a fixture in his life, well chosen, tastefully placed, perfectly maintained, like the imported Dutch flowers at our wedding. Pretty, appropriate, replaceable. Daniel came back into my life 4 months after the wedding. Richard's company was developing a large mixed-use property on the edge of the city, and Daniel's engineering firm had been contracted for the structural work, which meant that Daniel started coming to the estate occasionally for meetings with Richard, for working lunches, sometimes just to drop off documents when Richard wasn't available. I told myself I wasn't watching the calendar. I told myself it was coincidence that I always seemed to be home when he came by. The first few visits, we were perfectly polite, appropriate. He'd arrive, I'd offer coffee, we'd exchange a few sentences, and I'd disappear into another part of the house. He was my husband's brother. That was the beginning and end of the story. But one afternoon in November, gray sky, rain against the windows, Richard stuck at the office. Daniel arrived for a meeting that Richard had forgotten to cancel. I told him at the door. He glanced behind me at the empty house, then back at me, and said, "Do you want company anyway? I make genuinely terrible coffee, but I'm a decent conversationalist." I should have said no. I said, "The coffee here is good. Come in." We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. I don't even remember how it started. Something small, something ordinary. He asked me how I was settling into the area, whether I'd found places I liked, and instead of giving the polished, everything is wonderful answer I had been rehearsing for months, I said, "It's beautiful here. I just haven't figured out how to feel at home yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's honest." "Too honest, probably." "No," he said, "not enough people are." And that was it. That was the small crack in the door. Because he said it like he meant it, not as a compliment designed to make me feel good, just as a fact. We talked about real things. He told me about a project he'd worked on in Portugal for 2 years, a bridge reconstruction, and how he'd fallen in love with the city but come back because his father was sick. He asked me where I grew up, and when I told him the neighborhood, the reality of it, he didn't flinch, didn't perform sympathy, didn't change the subject. He just listened. No one in my new life had really listened to me. By the time he left, the rain had stopped and the kitchen was dark. I hadn't even noticed the sun going down. He stood at the door, jacket on, and said, "Thank you for the coffee, Natalie." "Thank you for staying," I said. And then I closed the door and stood with my back against it in the dark hallway, heart beating in a way it had absolutely no business beating. I told myself it was nothing. Loneliness does strange things to people. I knew that. I was isolated, understimulated, invisible inside my own marriage. A kind conversation with someone who actually looked at me while I spoke, of course, that would feel significant. It didn't mean anything. I repeated that to myself for 3 weeks. And then Richard told me that Daniel would be working out of a home office in our East Wing for the next 2 months to stay close to the project site, living under our roof. My husband delivered this information over dinner, eyes on his phone, fork in hand, as casually as if he were reporting the weather. "He'll mostly keep to himself. You won't even notice he's here." I looked down at my plate. I was already terrified of how much I would notice. Having Daniel in the house changed the air. That sounds dramatic, I know, but there is no other way to describe it. It was like the whole estate, all 12 rooms, all that polished marble and expensive silence suddenly had a pulse, a warmth it had never had before. And I hated myself for noticing. I hated myself for walking past the East Wing in the morning and listening for sounds of movement. I hated myself for taking slightly longer to get ready before coming downstairs. I hated myself. And I kept doing it anyway. We developed a routine without ever agreeing to one. Mornings, Daniel would be at the large table in the East Wing by 7, laptop open, blueprints spread across the surface. I would bring 2 cups of coffee, mine and his, and set his down without a word. Sometimes he'd look up and say thank you. Sometimes he'd just raise a hand, deep in concentration. Either way, I'd sit across from him with my own cup and read, or scroll through my phone, or just exist quietly in the same space as another human being who didn't make me feel invisible. It sounds so small. It was everything. Richard, and of course, noticed nothing. He was in the middle of the biggest deal of his career, some multi-city development partnership that had him flying to meetings twice a week and sleeping with his phone on the pillow like it was a second wife. He would pass Daniel in the hallway in the mornings, exchange a few clipped sentences about the project, and disappear into his car by 7:15. One evening, Richard actually said to me, genuinely, without any awareness of how it sounded, "Good, Daniel's here. At least you'll have someone to talk to." I smiled. I said, "Yes, it's been nice." And Richard nodded, satisfied, and went back to his phone. The moment things shifted, truly, irreversibly shifted, happened on a Wednesday evening in the 4th week of Daniel's stay. I was in the garden after dinner. It was one of those rare winter nights that almost feels like early spring, cool but not cold, the sky completely clear, stars visible in a way they never are in the city. I had a glass of wine, and I was sitting on the stone bench near the far edge of the garden, which is where I always went when I needed to breathe. I heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned, expecting Margaret. She had a habit of arriving unannounced, but it was Daniel. Jacket on, hands in his pockets, looking slightly hesitant. "Sorry," he said. "I saw you out here from the window. I can go back in." You don't have to. He sat down. Not close. There was a proper, respectable distance between us. We looked at the sky for a while without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence I had experienced inside that house in months. Then he said, quietly, "Are you happy, Natalie?" I turned to look at him. There was no agenda in his face, no manipulation, just a direct, honest question from someone who had been watching closely enough to already suspect the answer. I opened my mouth to say yes. The word was right there, ready, polished from months of use. Instead, what came out was, "I don't know." He nodded slowly, like he understood, like he had been waiting for me to say something true. "I don't think he sees you," Daniel said. "I don't think he knows what he has." The wine glass was cold in my hand. The stars were very bright, and every sensible, rational, self-protective instinct I had was screaming at me to stand up, go inside, and never sit in that garden with this man again. I stayed. I won't dress it up or make it sound more innocent than it was. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel and I crossed lines. Not physically, not then, but emotionally, completely. We talked for hours. We told each other things. I told him about my father's note. He told me about a woman he loved in Portugal who hadn't waited for him to come back. I told him that I had walked down my own wedding aisle feeling nothing. He told me that he had known, the moment he met me at the rehearsal dinner, that something was wrong, that I had the eyes of someone already in the process of disappearing. No one had ever seen me that clearly. And I think that was the moment I understood that I was in serious, serious trouble. Because what I felt for Daniel Calloway was not a crush born of loneliness. It was not gratitude dressed up as attraction. It was something real and deep and completely devastating in its timing. I was falling in love with my husband's brother. And then, on a Tuesday morning when Richard was in another city and the house was quiet, I went to call Daniel for coffee and found his laptop open on the East Wing table. He had stepped out briefly. The screen was still lit. I wasn't snooping. I want to make that clear. I was just reaching past it to move a coffee cup. But the email thread on the screen stopped me cold. It was between Daniel and a woman named Priya. The messages went back over a year. The language was intimate, unmistakably, undeniably intimate. But that wasn't what made my blood turn to ice. It was the last message in the thread, sent 3 days ago. She doesn't know, does she? About the agreement. And Daniel's reply, no, and she can't find out. Not yet. I stood there in the empty room, heart hammering, coffee going cold in my hand. The agreement. What agreement? She doesn't know. Who was she? And then, slowly, like ice water spreading through my chest, I realized she was me. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Before I saw that email, after I saw that email, I stood in that East Wing for a long time. Long enough for the coffee in my hand to go completely cold. Long enough for the light through the window to shift. Long enough for every warm memory of the past 4 weeks, every conversation, every shared silence, every honest word I thought had passed between us, to quietly rearrange itself into something darker and more frightening. She doesn't know. Not yet. I set the coffee cup down very carefully on the table, like if I moved too slowly nothing would shatter. Then I walked out of the East Wing, up the stairs, and into my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified kind. The ugly, gasping, betrayed kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep it surprises even you. Because here is the thing about being someone who grew up with nothing. You become very, very good at reading danger. You develop an instinct for it. You learn early that the things that look like safety sometimes have teeth. And for 4 weeks, I had ignored every single one of those instincts because Daniel had looked at me like I was worth seeing. And it had all been something else entirely. I didn't confront him that day. I know that probably sounds weak, but I had learned something important from years of having nothing. And it was this: never show your hand before you know what cards the other person is holding. Emotion is a luxury. Information is power. So when Daniel came back into the house an hour later and knocked gently on the kitchen doorframe and said, "Coffee still on?" I smiled. I said yes. I made 2 cups. I sat across from him at the kitchen table exactly as I had done every morning for 4 weeks. And while he talked about the project, about a problem with the foundation specs, I watched him, really watched him, looking for cracks in the performance, looking for the seams. He was good. I'll give him that. Warm eyes, easy laugh, that way of tilting his head slightly when he listened that made you feel like the most important person in the room. It was a very convincing performance. I had been giving a convincing performance for my entire marriage. I recognized the craft. That night, after Daniel had gone back to the East Wing and the house was quiet, I opened my own laptop. I started with what I knew. Richard and Daniel's father, the late Edward Calloway, had passed away 14 months ago, about 2 months before Richard and I got married. I knew this much. Richard had mentioned it briefly, once, in the same tone he used to mention traffic or weather. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to look into, because why would I, was the details of Edward Calloway's estate and will. It took me 2 hours of careful searching through property records, a legal announcement in a local business publication, and one very revealing old article about the Calloway family business to piece together what I believe was the truth. Edward Calloway had been deeply traditional, almost rigidly so, and according to the terms of his will, which had apparently caused significant tension between the brothers, the majority share of the Calloway family holdings, including several properties and a significant portfolio of investments separate from Richard's own company, would only fully transfer to Richard upon proof of a stable marriage and a legitimate family structure. Edward had apparently watched his son's bachelor lifestyle for 40 years with increasing displeasure. In other words, Richard needed to be married to access the full inheritance. And our wedding had taken place 2 months after Edward died. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. So there it was. Richard had married me, chosen me, charmed me, proposed to me in that rooftop restaurant, not entirely because he wanted me, but because he needed a wife. And quickly, I had been selected, fitted, placed. The cruelty of it was not even the discovery itself. The cruelty was realizing that some part of me had always known something was slightly off. The speed of the proposal, the efficiency of the wedding planning, Margaret's thinly veiled coolness toward me. And I had looked away from all of it because I wanted the security too badly to ask questions. We had used each other. But then, the email, the agreement, Daniel's name attached to it, which meant Daniel had known. Daniel had known about his brother's reasons for marrying quickly. And he had come here, warm, attentive, honest-eyed Daniel, with full knowledge of what I didn't know. She doesn't know. Not yet. Not yet. That word. That single word that implied a plan with a timeline. A reveal scheduled for a specific moment. What was he waiting for? What happened when the yet expired? I called Maya the next morning. My oldest friend, the only person I trusted completely, the woman who had grabbed Richard's business card out of my hand 2 years ago and told me not to throw it away. I told her everything. The email, the will, the timeline. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Natalie, get a lawyer. Today. Before you say a single word to either of them." "I don't want to blow this up before I understand it fully," I said. "Listen to me," Maya said, her voice dropping low and serious. "If what you're saying is true, if there's an agreement, then there is something at the end of that agreement that benefits someone. And right now, you don't know if that someone is you or if it's them." I stared out the window at the garden. The stone bench where Daniel had asked me if I was happy, where I had told him the most honest thing I'd said in months. "I don't know." "Maya," I said quietly, "what if Daniel wasn't trying to expose Richard's secret?" "What do you mean?" I swallowed hard. "What if he was here to make sure I never found out?" The line went silent, and somewhere down the hallway, I heard the east wing door open. Daniel was awake, and he was walking toward the kitchen. I hung up with Maya before he reached the kitchen. I set my phone face down on the counter, turned to the stove, and began making coffee like my hands weren't trembling. like my heart wasn't slamming against my ribs, like I hadn't just spent the last 18 hours quietly dismantling every assumption I had built my life on. Daniel appeared in the doorway in a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, hair slightly disheveled, looking so effortlessly real and human that for one devastating second I felt the pull of it again. That warmth, that ease, and I had to remind myself, firmly and deliberately, that this was the performance. This was the product. This was what I had been meant to feel. Morning, he said. Morning, I said. Coffee's almost ready. He sat down at the kitchen table. I kept my back to him, focused on the mugs, controlled my breathing. And then I made a decision. Not the safe decision. Not the careful, lawyer first, protect yourself decision that Maya's voice in my head was urgently recommending. A different kind of decision. The kind that comes not from strategy, but from somewhere older and more instinctive. The kind that says, I have been performing in this house for long enough. I want the truth, and I want it now. I turned around, set his coffee in front of him, and sat down directly across from him. Then I looked him in the eyes and said, very calmly, tell me about the agreement, Daniel. The change in his face was immediate. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated than guilt. A kind of resignation, like a man who has been waiting for a door to open and is almost relieved when it finally does, even though he knows what's on the other side. He looked down at the coffee cup, then back up at me. How much do you know? He asked. Enough, I said. I want to hear the rest from you. A long silence stretched between us. Outside, the groundskeeper's equipment hummed faintly somewhere across the garden. The refrigerator clicked and hummed. The whole house breathed around us. Then Daniel said, the will had a clause. Dad was old-fashioned. That's the kind word for it. Richard needed to be married for at least 2 years to receive the full inheritance. If the marriage ended before 2 years, the secondary holdings, properties, portfolio would be redirected to a family trust that Richard couldn't touch for another decade. So he needed a wife. He needed a wife who would stay. I let that settle. Stay. Not love, not partnership, not a real marriage. Just stay. Like a piece of furniture that needed to remain in the room for the appraisal. And you? I asked. Where do you fit into this? Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad left me a separate condition in the will. If I could verify, independently verify, that Richard's marriage was genuine and stable at the 18-month mark, I would receive my own portion of the estate. A smaller share, but significant. Verify, I repeated. The word tasted like metal. Meaning what, exactly? You came here to watch me? Report back? It started that way, he said, and his voice was low and he held my gaze when he said it, which I both respected and resented. Richard asked me to come. He said the project was real, and it is. That part is true, but yes, he wanted me close, to make sure things were stable, to make sure you weren't. He stopped. Wasn't what? Wasn't getting suspicious. Wasn't asking questions. The room was very quiet. So everything, I said slowly, the conversations, the garden, asking me if I was happy, all of it was surveillance. It started that way. He leaned forward. Natalie, I need you to hear me when I tell you it didn't stay that way. What happened between us, the real conversations, the honesty, that wasn't the plan. That was not what I came here to do. I came here to observe you from a distance and file a report and leave. But you were real, he said. You were the most real person I had encountered in years, and I did not know how to stay detached from that. I looked at him for a long time. The email, I said. Priya. She doesn't know. Not yet. What were you planning to tell me? He closed his eyes briefly. The truth. All of it. I had already decided, before you saw that email, before any of this, that I was going to tell you everything. I had already written to Richard and told him I wouldn't be filing any report, that he was on his own. When? I asked. When were you going to tell me? This week, he said quietly. I was going to tell you this week. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The garden was pale and frost-tipped in the early morning light. The stone bench where everything had shifted sat empty and still. I thought about the girl who had stared at a note on a kitchen table at 7 years old trying to understand what sorry meant. I thought about the woman who had walked down and all feeling nothing. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to build walls high enough to keep the worst of life out, and how I had still, somehow, ended up exactly here. Used, informed too late, holding feelings I had no safe place to put. I turned back to face Daniel. I want you to leave today, I said. He nodded. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't reach for my hand. He just nodded, and somehow that was the most honest response he could have given. Richard came home 2 days later. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in. No dinner on the table. No performance. Just me, on the sofa, with a folder of documents on the cushion beside me, documents that a very sharp family lawyer named Patricia had helped me gather over the previous 48 hours. Richard looked at the folder, then at my face. For the first time in our marriage, he actually looked at my face. Natalie, sit down, Richard. He sat. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I had done both of those things already, alone, in the quiet hours before dawn, and I was finished with them. I spoke calmly and precisely. I told him what I knew, all of it, in the same measured tone I imagined he used when closing business deals. When I finished, the room was silent. Then Richard, and this is the part one will never forget, said, I do care about you. In my way. I hope you know that. In my way. I almost laughed. Your way, I said, wasn't enough. I filed for divorce the following Monday, under the terms that Patricia had carefully constructed. Given the nature of the arrangement and certain financial vulnerabilities Richard very much preferred to keep private, the settlement was more than fair. The kind of settlement that meant I would never again stand at a mirror in a borrowed dress feeling nothing, wondering if security was worth the cost of everything else. As for Daniel, he called once, 3 weeks later. I let it ring. He sent one message, 4 sentences, no excuses, no declarations. Just, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I just want you to know that what was real between us was real. I'm sorry it came wrapped in something dishonest. I hope you find exactly what you deserve. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and went for a walk, alone, outside, in the cold winter air. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something clean and uncomplicated move through my chest. Not love, not anger, not grief, just freedom. The wide, quiet, extraordinary feeling of a woman who finally knows her own worth and has decided, at last, to stop discounting it for anyone. I didn't fall in love with Daniel Calloway's honesty. I fell in love with my own, once I finally found it again. And that was worth every single painful step it took to get there.